I think it's not an exaggeration to say that I've been waiting about half a decade to have this conversation with you. You see, 5 years ago, I was absolutely sure I was the only person in the history of the planet, in the world at the time, who had left Islam. I was raised quite religious. My family are very religious. My first book was the Riyadh al-Salihin by Imam Nawawi. I've been praying, fasting, going Umrah in Makkah, praying extra hard on Laylatul Qadr, which is like a special night for Muslims, since as far as I can remember. And I'm British, but I was raised partly in Saudi Arabia and partly here in the holy city of East London for Bangladeshis who are British. And I also know what anti-Muslim bigotry feels like. I went to a school where after 9/11, my nickname was literally inventively terrorist. It was very inventive. So I understand kind of the different tensions on identity and things like that, at least for myself growing up. And 5 years ago, I didn't know you could leave it. I didn't know you could leave Islam. I was absolutely certain that I was completely insane. Because I was thinking, how could I be so arrogant that 1.8 billion people are Muslims, fastest growing religion in the world, TM. My family, people who are the best people I know, who are very religious. How could they be wrong? How could I be so arrogant? And, oh, that's better. At the same time, I was also sure, well, I don't believe this anymore. It doesn't make any sense. So you've got this kind of tension you can see in what I've just told you. And I still remember, if I kind of pull myself back there and that situation I was in, being stuck and being like, imagine yourself and everything else is dark and the darkness is closing down on you. That's how it feels, because you don't have any mechanism psychologically as a way out. And that feeling that I've just described to you, if you can kind of close your mind's eye and picture it, is the feeling that you need to first understand when you want to think about someone who calls themselves an ex-Muslim. We are born alone when we are born into being an ex-Muslim, when we leave for the first time. And can you imagine what that isolation must do to a person, to anyone? Doesn't matter how old you are, what gender you are, whether you're gay or straight, what that does to someone. So obviously, I was not the only person who had left Islam ever. I found that out quite quickly. There's a place on the internet called Reddit, and there's a subreddit called ex-Muslim, and there was 2,000 of us at the time. This is back in the day. We now have 27,000 people or something. And it's a place where ex-Muslims from around the world would share stories, advice to each other, and of course, memes, the dankest memes. I said that now, and I won't take it back. Now, every story for me there was magical. Like, it was so magical, because for me, imagine being someone who felt alone. Every time someone told a story or gave advice, it's like, wow, there's more of us. Like, we're not alone. And we all felt that at the time, and still now. Now, you can imagine quite quickly, that's a very online space. It's not real, and humans, we are social creatures. So we started meeting online. So I'd meet people in Starbucks and be like, please don't be crazy or try to kill me. And it'd be fine. And we started doing that more and more. And I set up groups, basically. There's one in London, in the Midlands, one in Australia for some reason. My friends set up groups in America, Canada, etc. And these groups were very Fight Club. You can only get in if you know someone who knows it, and there's like a whole process. And that's how things grew. Now, as I spent more time being an ex-Muslim and meeting other ex-Muslims, I noticed a certain anger. There's a real anger. And then I started noticing, hey, wait a second, this is not just with ex-Muslims. So other people from, for example, Jehovah's Witness backgrounds, ultra-Orthodox Jewish backgrounds, even, Catholic backgrounds, they had a certain anger to them as well when they leave and they think, and they often say this, I thought I was the only one. And that shared hurt led me to set up what's called Faith to Faithless now. We're part of Humanist UK, and We help all people who leave faith and when there are high control mechanisms in the families or communities they come from. So that anger, I really understand where it comes from, because I had that too. We're angry because there's all these accusations that ex-Muslims get. People either ignore us, that's the first easiest way to deal with people who leave Islam. You act like we don't exist. The other way is to stereotype and to accuse, to say, for example, you just left Islam because you wanted to have a party, have a drink, have sex. It's like, well, you could just do that as a Muslim, as many, many Muslims do, and sometimes happily so, sometimes not happily so. There's also this sort of stereotype, like, you're calling yourself an ex-Muslim, that is hurting Muslims, that is causing problems within the context of anti-Muslim bigotry. Sometimes imams will say to families, sure, don't hurt your children when they leave Islam, or don't hurt your father when he leaves Islam, but you cannot accept them as a member of your family. So there are, of course, imams that say crazy stuff like, hey, the hudud punishment is death. But I'm talking about familial advice where it's like, hey, that's cool, let's not hurt them, but you cannot have a relationship. And of course, there's other types of stereotypes. I mean, the best one for me is, who's paying you? Who's paying you to say this? So obviously, it's always either the Illuminati or the Jews. I can confirm the Illuminati have not yet paid me. I am looking for that sweet Illuminati money, just hasn't come in yet. And I think the sort of fourth party that I think about that angers a lot of ex-Muslims in terms of the stereotypes we get and the things that make us really angry is actually from non-Muslims. It's from particularly sort of the liberal sort of left. I mean, I'm from I would say, a more leftist political spectrum, but I've seen it a lot, where there's this kind of very paternalistic, slightly and probably very racist view that where they'll say things like, you're a native informant, you're an Uncle Tom, you're a coconut. Somehow religion is intrinsic to the color of our skin and where we come from and the communities we grow up in, rather than being something that is an idea that you can or cannot be part of. And what it does is it says that dissent and discussion is a white thing. It's a very Western thing, when clearly it's obviously not. And that's very Orientalist to say and to assume. So you can understand where some of this anger comes from when you speak to people who've left faith, particularly ex-Muslims. And I think one of the greatest things we have in Britain and in some of these countries today is we have the ability that we can express our faith in whatever color that might look like, whatever clothing that might look like, things like that. And I think part of that freedom is the responsibility to make sure that people who want to also disagree with it. So whether they're people who want to, there are ex-Muslims who just want to live their lives. They don't want to really talk about Islam. They're not interested. Cool. And there are ex-Muslims that want to criticize or discuss Islam. And that should be cool too, just like we can criticize humanism or atheism or whatever it is. So for me here, I'm the luckiest ex-Muslim in the world right now. Why is that? Because I'm here in the British Islam Conference. I'm so privileged in that no ex-Muslim has had this opportunity ever anywhere. And why I feel so happy is that I can speak out to people in this audience and people on YouTube who will see this, who are directly speaking to my family, my friends, and the Muslim community to say that this is important. And what I want to say to you is, let's be honest. The word ex-Muslim is a terrible term. Who wants to define themselves as a negative? Like, no one, right? The reason it exists is because of the vacuum, the vacuum of identity, the vacuum of choice. And, when I think about from 5 years ago, half a decade ago, when I left Islam, we've come a long way. Actually, now young people do know, not just young actually, people do know that you can leave Islam. It is something that is talked about, often negatively at mosques, but hey, we're starting somewhere. And we need to make sure together that we can fight to make sure that people who leave are loved unconditionally and have the choice to talk about their ideas. And I'm not even, notice how I've not even gone into, let's not have hudud punishments where we say they should be killed. I mean, I'm not even going to go into that because, duh. But I mean, even far further back down, when it comes to families and communities, we need to be able to have this space so that we can get rid of that term forever, which is what I want. I don't like that term. I have to use it. And it's what I'm saying here, what I'm saying is not very fluffy, and I'll tell you why. Because as an ex-Muslim in this space, and because I've created so many groups, I've probably worked with more ex-Muslims and to some extent their families, or at least dealt with that conversation between them and their families than almost anyone else. And actually, what's very promising is things get better. It's very hard. People get on the street, they get kicked out on the streets. They could be 14-year-olds when that happened. I've seen that happen quite often. People get death threats in certain countries. I've known people in Iraq who've had to run away from the Shia militia. That happens. But at least in the West and in some place in the East where sort of this political issue is not the biggest issue, families do come around. It might not be perfect. It might not be unconditional. But it's because the power of love is actually quite powerful. People don't realize that. I often say this as a little sort of, I wouldn't say a story, but a little primer to ex-Muslims who come to me who are scared about their families throwing them out or rejecting them. I say, sure, you've now been kicked out of home, you're there on your own, or you've ran away, you're there on your own for a day. But your family also have spent 20 years raising you up. They're also going to spend that first night in bed worrying, oh my God, what have we done? So it works both ways, and that really helps ex-Muslims frame their parents, because their parents, like me, like you, are human beings, and the power of love is quite important. So what can I do? What do I want from everyone watching this or everyone in this audience right now? What I want is your voice. The reason for that is, somewhere in your world, someone will leave Islam. That will happen. It'll be your family, it'll be yourself, it'll be your sibling, it'll be the person you're married to, it's your partner, it will happen. And it's going to be much more common that it happens now because people are speaking out. So when it happens, I ask you to support that person. When I left Islam, I first did the trendy millennial thing. I came out on Facebook. Actually, I'd been ex-Muslim for a couple of years, and imagine I'd been doing all this work and I was still secret. My family didn't know. Right, for 3 years, I think it was. And I just was like, no, I need to just tell. I can't hold it in me anymore. And I said it on Facebook, and I remember there was comments, but they didn't really mean as much because I knew I'd get comments from non-Muslims who already knew about it or supported me. It was a comment from a Muslim friend of mine from the ISOC that I had been going to at LSE, who said publicly, I got private message, publicly said, hey Imtiaz, she said, I support you. I want you to know that, no matter what, I love you, and that will not change. And honestly, I remember like, whoa, man, that's like really messed me up quite a bit. And she's, to this day, someone who supports me. And imagine that one person could have made the difference to my mental health, to how I feel about myself, that one person. So be that one person. She's Muslim, and she's still Muslim today. She's a cool Muslim, she has tattoos, but, So I want to finish with this thought, which is that it's only, sure, we can as ex-Muslims, and I can as an ex-Muslim, work to kind of further the rights of people who leave Islam and people who leave other religions, but it's only together that we can actually make sure that in our communities, that there's no kid who sat there asking themselves, am I the only person who's left Islam? And also asking themselves, will my mother still love me? That's a big question. I want us to solve that problem. Thank you.